It's our great pleasure and honor to welcome Don George, a well-traveled and well-seasoned travel writer and journalist, who's going to talk to us about what has changed in the past 40 years. And we look very much forward to it. Don, please.
Thank you very much for that introduction. It's a great honor and pleasure to be here today. I remember back in the 80s when I was the travel editor at the San Francisco paper, and I had lots of friends in Hong Kong who belonged to the FCC. And I remember always thinking one day I wanted to come and visit, and it's such a storied, historic, legendary place, and I always meant to get here, and somehow I never did. So it's really an honor and a pleasure, a great pleasure to be here today and to see you all. Thank you so much for coming. And thanks to the FCC for inviting me to be here. I really would like to be here for the Clinton-Trump discussion. Maybe I'll have to come back. That will be fun. So I've been a travel writer and editor for 40 years, and in that time, as you all know, the travel world has changed profoundly and fundamentally. The part of the travel world that I've inhabited all those years, the neighborhood I've frequented, which is travel publishing, has also changed equally profoundly and fundamentally. I thought today I would touch on a few examples of the good and the bad that's resulted from these changes. And then I just wanted to open the floor to explore this topic with you further and explore any other topics you might want to explore in the question and answer period to follow. To touch very briefly on the publishing aspect of this topic, in my own life, I've embodied the changes that have swept through the world of publishing in the past 40 years. 30 years ago, I was the travel editor at the San Francisco Examiner and Chronicle. And in that role, I was one of perhaps a dozen editors in the United States who essentially controlled the dissemination of travel information to American travelers. There were a handful of magazines and a handful of newspaper travel sections. And if you were an American traveler and you wanted to get information, those were the sources you went to. And as a result, there was an extremely limited, extremely well curated, but extremely limited sort of palette of information available to travelers. Good points and bad points, but it was a very different scene from how it is today. 20 years ago, with the advent of the internet, I left the newspaper. I kind of saw the writing on the wall to a certain extent. And I joined a robust and ambitious startup that was called Salon.com. I don't know, are you at all familiar with Salon.com? It was a pretty groundbreaking web magazine, we called ourselves at the beginning. Became a website. I founded the travel section of Salon.com, which was called Wanderlust. And I think perhaps I like to think that in a small way I helped shape the evolution of travel journalism online. We started real-time reports from different places around the world. We would have reporters literally writing as explosions were happening or as celebrations were happening, as news was happening. They would be sending their dispatches to us and we would be publishing them. And we had columnists who published serial columns that now would later come to be known as blogs. So in some ways, we probably published among the first blogs ever done. 10 years ago, I joined Lonely Planet. And I imagine that many of you are familiar with Lonely Planet. Probably, perhaps at least, the biggest travel media company in the world. I wrote an online column for them, and I was their global travel editor, and so I was their global spokesperson. Traveling around the world, giving talks about travel, the nature of travel, the meaning of travel. And I saw firsthand in that role how the advent and growth of the internet began to erode Lonely Planet's authority, and how someday it might totally transform the world of travel information. Well, now we're flush in the middle of that transformation, that revolution or evolution, where travel information is available from seemingly infinite sources. Personal blogs, social media accounts, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and then crowdsourcing sites like TripAdvisor. All of these have come to supplant, to a large extent, that initial curatorial group of 24 people that I was a part of 30 years ago in the United States. Even the websites like Salon, and certainly the purveyors of travel information like Lonely Planet, have been seriously challenged, undermined, stretched by the growth of crowdsourcing information and sites like TripAdvisor and their brethren. There's been a proliferation of online content that's changed the way that travelers get information, and it's changed the kind of information that travelers get. The instantaneity in terms of availability and connectedness has also transformed the way that we all travel. Back when I was the Lonely Planet spokesperson, one of my prime messages was along the lines of, "Thank you very much for buying Lonely Planet guidebooks. We appreciate your traveling with us, but we also want to encourage you to leave the guidebook in the hotel room one day of your trip and get out and get lost. Don't bring us with you. Get lost. Have an adventure." That was something I loved to tell people. And now what I would like to say to travelers is, leave your cell phone and your tablet in your hotel room and go out and be in the moment and get lost and have an adventure. Because I'm sure, as you've all seen, people travel around the world now and they spend more time absorbed in that little real estate in their palm than they do in the real estate, the world around them. And it's diminished the travel experience in some ways, I think, quite seriously. On the other hand, of course, it's also enabled the travel experience in some ways. So it's definitely a mixed bag. But I want to tell two stories that I think illustrate both the good and the bad aspects of this. The first is about a recent visit I made to Siem Reap. I was going to Singapore to give a talk at a conference. Most of my life, I'd wanted to get to Angkor Wat. When I was a little boy, I'd seen a photograph of Angkor Wat in a National Geographic magazine, and I'd thought, wow, someday I'm going to get there. And I'd never gotten there, despite all these years as a travel writer and editor. And looking on the map, I realized that Siem Reap was a hop, skip, and a jump from Singapore. So I set up a trip to go to Siem Reap to see Angkor Wat. I got to Angkor Wat, and my expectations were really, really disappointed. It wasn't that Angkor Wat isn't an extraordinary monument, it is, but at Angkor Wat and at the sites all around Angkor Wat, I was overwhelmed by all of the people who were there apparently trying to find a backdrop for their selfies and for their Facebook posts, and pretty much oblivious as to the place they were in. So they would be in a sacred doorway, and they would have a flamboyant uniform on, and they'd be doing this. And then this. And I wanted to stop them and say, you realize that this is a thousand centuries old monument that you're taking your picture in, right? Do you have any sense of what this place is all about? And I don't think they did. I felt like the sites were being overrun with people looking for those photo moments. And so Siem Reap was terribly disappointing to me. Even Angkor Wat was disappointing to me. That was the bad side of all of this, the tyranny of the selfie, the desire to social mediaize every moment of your trip so that you could share it with your friends back home, and they would say, oh my gosh, you're in this amazing place, and you would have already moved on to the next place unaware of where you'd been. So the disrespect for the ancient sites, the use of sacred places as selfie backdrops, that pretty much ruined the atmosphere for me. But the good was that because of the internet, before I went to Siem Reap, I was able to do some research about other places to see in Cambodia. And I stumbled across a place called Bante Chamar. Has anybody been to Bante Chamar? It's a village about 3.5 hours north by taxi of Siem Reap. It's a place where jungle temples still exist and there are no people taking selfies. It's a place where the internet doesn't work. I found out about Bante Chamar and by doing some research online, and there was something in Bante Chamar called the Community Tourism Project. That was the only way you could possibly get a place to stay. You had to set up a homestay. And so I was able to set up a homestay in Bante Chamar through my computer. Siem Reap disappointed me, but I had booked 3 nights in Bante Chamar, and so I set off for that with some trepidation, not knowing what I'd find. I got there. I was met by a man with the Community Tourism Project. He said he would walk me through the puddled streets to my home, my stay for the next 3 nights. When I got there, a man holding a baby in a sarong, a man in a sarong holding a baby, greeted me. He didn't speak any English. It was a stilt home. He pointed me up the stairs to where my bed was. Before I went up, I said to the host who'd greeted me, how's the internet connectivity here? He looked at me and he said, no internet. No internet. And I thought, what have I gotten myself into? 3 days without the internet. How will I survive? Well, of course, they turned out to be the best 3 days I could have imagined. I got to know the villagers. I got a little wobbly bike that I rode around. I stumbled into stilt house encampments. By the end of my second day, people were waving at me, inviting me to come in, inviting me to sit down. So because of that lack of connectivity, I was really, really able to connect. I was able to connect with the people and the place, and I had one of my best travel experiences I've had in a long, long time. But I wouldn't have found out about it if not for the internet. So that's the good and the bad. And the other story I wanted to share is a kind of a remarkable experience I had recently on a trip to the Japanese island of Shikoku. Do you know Shikoku? Anybody? My wife hails from Shikoku. I lived in Tokyo for 2 years, and I met her. She was a student at a university during that time. She's from Shikoku. It's the smallest of the 4 main Japanese islands. It's located in the inland sea, kind of to the south and east of Honshu, the main island. I wrote a story about Shikoku for National Geographic Traveler magazine a few years ago, and they were so excited by that story that they decided to create a trip to go to Shikoku. And they created a trip, and then another adventure travel company that I work for called Geographic Expeditions, a different company, also read the story, and they decided to create a trip really focused on the article that I'd written. So I began leading trips to Shikoku for GeoX, and there are actually some brochures and some catalogs by GeoX about the trip I lead and some other trips in the hallway there. But on my most recent trip to Shikoku, the GeoX trip, one of the travelers was a man named Tom Barron. And it turned out that he, 40 years ago, had been going to Oxford. He'd been a student at Oxford, and he met a man named Alex Kerr. Well, Alex Kerr is the author of a book called Lost Japan, which is a very wonderful book about Japan. Alex, after Oxford, was a student in Tokyo. But rather than study in the classroom, he decided to study outside the classroom. And he began wandering around different parts of Japan, and he found his way to Shikoku. And he fell in love with Shikoku, and he decided he wanted to buy a farmhouse there. That was relatively easy to do because the farmhouses were all being abandoned because people were moving out of the island. He found a farmhouse, fell in love with it, bought it, and wrote it to his friend Tom Barron saying, "Come and help me renovate this farmhouse." So 40 years ago, Tom Barron spent a summer on the island of Shikoku, kind of in the middle of nowhere, in a region called the Iya Valley, renovating this farmhouse. 40 years later, Tom Barron showed up in Kyoto, met me as the tour guide in the lobby of the hotel, and showed me a photo of him with a woman. And he said, 40 years ago, photo, he said, "I want to meet this woman." I said, "Tom, Japan is a nation of millions of people. I think the odds of us finding this woman are extremely, extremely bad." He said, "Well, let's try." So through the whole trip, I was thinking, I'm going to disappoint this man who's spent 40 years thinking about the moment of meeting this woman. Well, Tom had found out about our Shikoku trip through the internet because he'd been looking for Shikoku travel adventures. We got to Shikoku. We got to the Iya Valley. When we got to the Iya Valley, because there are no Westerners who ever visit the Iya Valley, there was a little contingent of people from the local tourism board holding up a sign that said, "Welcome to Iya." It was extremely charming. We got off the bus. I showed the picture to the local tourism people and said, "We want to find this woman." And I explained the story of the renovating the farmhouse. The farmhouse that he had renovated was on our itinerary. It has become a place called Chiiori. It's a 300-year-old farmhouse that Alex Kerr renovated, and now people can stay there. And as it turned out, we were staying there. So that was wonderful. But when I showed the photo to the tourism people, they all looked at each other and went, "Sorewa, I don't know how we're going to be able to do that. I don't think so." But they all pulled out their cell phones and they began rapid fire. And suddenly all of Japan was being brought into this conversation. Tom remembered one name. He wasn't sure if it was that woman's name or somebody else's name, but he remembered a name. When we got to Chiiori, we found a neighbor, and we mentioned this name to the neighbor, and the neighbor said, "Oh, that's the daughter of Ueda-san, who lives over there." So we went and we knocked on the door of Ueda-san's house and said the name to her, and she said, "Ah, that's my daughter, but she moved away a long time ago. I'm so sorry." And we all went, "Ah, okay." And then we showed her the picture, and she said, she kind of looked at it like this and like that, and she said, "I think that might be Maeda-san." And everyone's ears perked up. We went, "Maeda-san, where is Maeda-san? Where is she?" And she said, she lives just over the hill there, right over the hill. So suddenly 3 tourism people and 5 foreigners were racing over the hill to see Maeda-san's house. We got to the crest of the hill. We looked down. There was a beautiful old farmhouse and a woman, an old stooped woman in the courtyard sweeping. And I just felt this kind of electric feeling through my skin. And I wondered if that might possibly be Ueda-san, Maeda-san. We walked around, we came down, we sort of got on the perimeter of the courtyard, and we looked in, and this woman looked quizzically up at us. "Why are there 5 foreigners in the middle of nowhere in my courtyard?" The 3 tourism people came up and explained the situation, and she looked a little confused. And then Tom Barron broke out of our group and came forward to her and showed her the photo. And she looked at the photo, and she looked at him, and she looked at the photo, and she looked at him. And suddenly I could literally see the spark of recognition ignite her eyes. And she went, "Ah, Tom-san!" And Tom went, "Maeda-san!" And they had this big hug. And her face just erupted into the biggest smile I've ever seen, and tears came running down her cheeks. And she said in Japanese, "You came back." And it turned out that when he had left 40 years before, they had looked at each other in the eye, and she had said to him, "You must come back." And he had said, "I will." And suddenly there he was, and there she was, and there was this incredible sense of euphoria that I think spread all the way through the Iya Valley. And it wouldn't have happened if not for the internet and Tom Barron finding me and my trip, and then us getting to Chiori, and then all those cell phone calls and all of the train of steps and steps and steps and steps that led to this extraordinary encounter. So I felt that technology is not always bad. Technology can make some really amazing things happen. Connections can occur because of that technological transformation that would never, never, never otherwise have been possible. So that was one story that proved for me both there is good in this transformation. Sometimes magic can happen in the world still. And that's just an image, the moment when her eyes ignited in recognition is an image that I'm going to take away with me for the rest of my life. So Shikoku is one of those off the beaten path places that the magic can be brought forward to us through using technology in an appropriate way. And that's just a story that really makes me understand why I travel, why we must travel, why travel is so incredibly important to the future and the connectivity of the planet on a personal level. So I'm going to stop with that story and open the floor to questions. And thank you for allowing me to share those stories with you, and I look forward to answering your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed your comments and your stories. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about maybe a controversial part, but maybe also a beneficial part of the internet. And I'm thinking really about the ability of the internet to influence governments in the area of tourism. And as a point, I would say I have also read Alex Kerr's books, and Dogs and Demons was one that really struck me, where I think in that book he was quite critical of the Japanese tour industry, and it seems tourism industry, and it seems to me that things have changed quite a lot in Japan.
Right. Absolutely. I think that, well, Alex is a really poignant example. He was extremely critical of the evolution of the Japanese culture, the way it was losing a lot of its traditional appreciation of art and aesthetics and architecture. And he actually stepped in to do something about it. The first thing he did was buy that farmhouse and renovate Chiiori. And then he started a foundation to save the old machiya in Kyoto, the old, long, traditional houses. And he's renovated about 8 of those, and people can stay there now. And most recently, he went back to the Iya Valley, the place that he fell in love with, and he bought 8 more farmhouses, and he's renovated the farmhouses. And so he's a great example of someone who didn't just criticize what he thought was wrong, but decided to do something about it. And on my most recent trip there, I actually saw the 8 farmhouses. They're beautifully, pristinely renovated houses that Westerners can stay in very comfortably. They have Western-style toilets. They have heating. They've been adapted to a modern traveler, and yet they retain the feel of the ancient Japanese farmhouse. And so Alex has been an extraordinary example of somebody who criticized the tourism industry and then decided to get involved and actually transform it. And he's actually a friend of mine now, and he meets somewhat regularly with the Prime Minister and with the main tourism people, and they've actually adopted him and decided to make use of his attitude and his perspective, and they're trying to renovate Shikoku through these kinds of efforts. And so that, to me, is extremely powerful and inspiring. I think that it's a mixed, across the globe, it's a mixed record with the ability of the internet to influence places. I find it daunting sometimes that TripAdvisor becomes the curatorial, the curator of travel experience. And I think that governments who pay attention to that would really need to rethink how they're making their decisions or exactly who they're listening to. I think that the internet is extremely powerful and we can gather a lot of great information from it, but that there are also experts who need to be consulted and whose views need to be weighed carefully against the crowdsourcing people. And it's just a very difficult, it's a new world that we're entering. And I think the really enlightened governments understand there's a lot of potential in this crowdsourcing and in the internet and in the information that's available there and in the feedback that you get, but that there's a long, distinguished body of people who've been traveling all their lives and are really travel experts who have a better perspective on what needs to be preserved and cultivated and nurtured. And so I think it's a broad conversation that's still unfolding right now. It's interesting being in my position because I like to think I'm one of those experts, but I also have to pay attention to the internet because these days your success online is measured by how many hits you get or how many eyeballs you get. And that's something that I always go back and forth with. Quality does not always equal eyeballs. And so it's an ongoing conversation as part of the weave of what I deal with all the time now. Thanks for the question.
Two things particularly spring to mind about tourism that the internet can facilitate or not, depending. One is when you talked about how your cell phone didn't work, you had no internet.
I'm sorry, how?
Yeah, how your cell phone didn't work. You go
Yes,
to
right.
Cambodia and you can't
Right.
connect. And you don't speak the language.
Right.
But yet you fit in because you're in a homestay. I think that in the days when you were probably 30 years ago in that very clean group of 12, a lot of people who did tours looked for a very westernized sliver of life that they could layer through places safely, cleanly. And the comment you made about Western toilets, I was once in a research group with some women of my age, of a certain age, talking about where we had traveled, and I was talking about traveling in Asia with them, and I said something to them about facilities and, understanding that culturally things aren't always what you have in the West, and she says, well, what do you mean? And I said, well, toilet facilities and everything. Well, she didn't know what I was talking about. Everywhere she went had perfectly, Western facilities just like everybody else. And I thought, she's not going to the same Asia that I go to.
Right, right.
And I think that there is the thing that the internet allows people to be more comfortable enough to be brave, to go to places because that's their lifeline, that's their tether. If they get too scared, if they get too disconnected, they can use their phone. They can use it to translate, or in case they're afraid of getting lost, they have Google Maps or whatever. So that's the one thing that I am interested how you see people using that in their travel. And the other aspect of it is the whole working there versus visiting component. And, for young people, there's things like groups like People to People and others that encourage young people to go do homestays in another country. But is the tourism industry looking more at ways to give people more live-work experience as part of their tour? So you're not just a guest. Because one of the things I learned from working in other countries is the places I have worked, I learned so much more there than the places that I visit.
Yeah.
And I think it's the difference whether you're on that little clean level at the top that's all Western sanitized, where you're staying at the Western hotel and you're having the pre-approved thing you can find on the internet, versus if you get sucked into a situation where sometimes students get it a little bit more, but workers get it. How can tourism get into that?
Yeah, those are great questions. I think that to answer the second one first, or to address the second one first, I think that the tourism industry is probably not much interested in encouraging people to live in other places. They're more interested in encouraging people to travel with them to a place for a limited time and then go back home and then travel with them again, because that's where their bread and butter is. There are certainly other organizations that encourage people to live abroad, and my early experiences were living in France and Greece and Japan for multiple months and years, and I absolutely agree. You get much more out of it when you're a local than when you're just parachuting in and going back out again. So I think that's not a banner that the travel industry is ever going to get behind, but I think it is a wonderful thing to do. I think that the travel industry is more interested in making money, and they make money by providing happy experiences for their guests. I do think there's an elite group of travel companies, and I think GeoX is one of them, that isn't at all afraid to make their guests uncomfortable. In a way, people travel with them because they will be uncomfortable, but in a comfortable setting. That's kind of the point of it. And Shikoku can be a very uncomfortable place in terms of some of the facilities, but it's the warmest, most open, hospitable, generous place you'll find on the planet. So I think there are definitely companies that do that, that push the border that way, push the boundary that way. Let's see, the first question was about, so using technology. I do think it makes you braver. It makes people braver, absolutely. When you're able to use your device to translate or take a photo of a menu and know what you're eating, it does make you braver. And I like to think that it makes you braver, which results in your being able to do that same thing when you don't have connectivity in your hand. When you suddenly are confronted with the menu and you have no idea what you're getting, and yet you communicate with the owner of the restaurant to say, pork, oink, oink, chicken. You find a way to communicate. And to my mind, that still is the wonder and thrill of travel, is that situation where you're way out of your comfort zone, you're worried and exhilarated at the same time. And I like to think that technology leads us to those moments when technology fails and the real human, the even greater human connections occur. So I do think technology helps me make people braver. I think there are some people who get stuck with it and can't go beyond it. And that's not good, but those people who are able to go beyond it, it definitely is one step on the path to their liberation as travelers in situations where they would be very, very uncomfortable a year ago or 2 years ago or 3 years ago, and now suddenly they feel like, I can do this. I've done it with my device in my palm, now I can do it without that device in my palm. And I think that's a really wonderful evolution that we're watching.
Professor Ben Martin from the UK, here in Hong Kong for 3 weeks. It used to be said that travel broadens the mind. Is that still the case today in an era of globalization, the internet? You use this phrase about TripAdvisor being the curator of travel information. Right. An era where we have hundreds of millions of people traveling now and tending to sort of homogenize the world.
Right.
And you gave your little example of this little village you visited. In 10 years' time, you've told us, you've probably told the world through the internet, if you went back in 10 years' time, I suspect you would find hundreds of people there, and you'd be disappointed. So you've been very successful in terms of making us all want to travel, but are we destroying what was originally the reason for traveling? Right. The breadth, the diversity, the difference.
Right. When the world is totally ruined, I will say, my work now is done. That's a really great question. It's definitely at the heart of my feelings about what I do as a travel writer and as a traveler. And I have a lot of different answers swirling in my brain right now, but one answer is that I do think travel absolutely still broadens us, and I think it's in some ways even more important than ever, because we sit at home in our living room, in our comfortable living room, on our computer, and we look at photos and videos of some faraway place, and we think, I think I've been there. Maybe I don't need to go. But then when we go there, we realize, of course, how incredibly different it is to be in a place than to watch it. And I've done some of the virtual reality things, and I think even those, while they do make you feel much more like you're there in the moment that you have that headset on, as soon as you take it off, you're not there anymore, and that's irreplaceable. So I do think that travel broadens the mind still very, very much, and in some ways it's more essential now than ever before to teach us the wonder of being out in the world and interacting with people we don't have a common language with or common culture with, and how we can exist as human beings together. When I was at Lonely Planet, Tony Wheeler, the founder of Lonely Planet, the wonderful man who started the company, and I often had this discussion about, are we ruining the planet or not? And his feeling, which I agreed with very much, was that human beings are adventurous. There's a certain subset of human beings who will always go out and explore the world. And as travel guidebook publishers or as travelers who love the world, we can do one of two things. We can let them go off willy-nilly and do what they do, or we can try to educate them so that when they go off to some far-off place, they have some sense of what the do's and don'ts are there, and some sense of the culture, and some sense of the history, so that they're more respectful travelers. People are going to hit the far corners of the planet one way or another, Tony and I would say, and it's better that they at least have some understanding of where they're blundering into, rather than just blundering into it and probably causing a lot more ruin that way. So I like to think that lovely dear Bante Chamar that I wrote about on the BBC Travel website, and a lot of people read it, that 10 years from now, there will be controlled tourism there. There'll probably be some hostels, there may be a little budget hotel, those jungle ruins. I won't be the only person clambering over them anymore. I think that's inevitable. But I like to think that the people who are there will have my story in their head, and they'll realize that this is a very, very special place that needs to be respected and cherished and honored, and hopefully they'll do that. And they won't just be running over the ruins and ruining them more than they're ruined already, that they'll be honoring them and respecting them and living in that dear Bante Chamar in a way that in some ways makes it even dearer and better. And it's a very complicated equation, but that's my feeling about what I do. That's why I can look myself in the mirror every morning and feel okay about it.
Sorry, first of all, Tony Watson, Hong Kong Society of Financial Analysts. Forward-looking question, what do you think your industry, either the travel industry or the travel writing industry, is going to look like or is going to evolve given A, the increased availability or the ease of travel given the internet and cheap travel, more accessible flights and so on, and B, the increasing isolationist sentiment we're seeing around the world as exemplified by things like Brexit, the candidacy of Donald Trump, and just reluctance to engage in international trade treaties and so on?
Yeah, wow. Those are great questions. I think that my feeling is that despite some of the profound and especially headline-grabbing divisions that we see today, fundamentally, I think that human beings are interested in connection and expansion of themselves. And in my own life, I've found that prime way to do that is encountering people from other cultures and backgrounds and learning from them, and hopefully they learn from me as well. And I feel, despite some evidence to the contrary, I feel that that's a really, really strong human impulse. It's what drives us. And I think that will continue. And I think that the accessibility of travel experiences in some ways will fuel that. It will make it easier for people to get outside their own small homes. It will give them information that will help them navigate those places outside their homes better. And I hope it will inspire them to realize that the world is bigger than their backyard, and the world is bigger than Brexit and Mr. Trump, and that in the long run, there's a surge towards interconnectedness around the globe that will triumph. I remember a really poignant moment when I went to Berlin, and there was a person who'd been a child when the Berlin Wall was built, and she told me the whole story of how the wall was built and how it went up overnight and how divisive that was. And then there was the moment when it came down and everyone electrically ran to the wall, and I just had this feeling that the 4 words came into my brain, which was, walls fall, people rise. And I really think that's true through human history. Walls fall, people rise. It may take a really long time, but that's the path we're on. And I still believe that, and my 40 years of traveling around the world have actually sort of led me to believe that more than ever, more strongly than I did 40 years ago or 30 years ago, that people are hungry for information from the outside world. I'm hungry for information from them. We share. Travel's a two-way street, and we all benefit from that. And I think there's this deep-seated sense of that in most human beings. That's my perhaps Pollyanna-ish point of view, but that's what I feel.
I travel quite a bit between Hong Kong and the U.S. It's a long flight. I just wonder if you have the same take as I do as the real magic of travel that you really can't put your finger on. When you arrive in a different city, each city has a different feeling.
Yeah.
You could feel something different if you land in Manila or Tokyo or wherever, Hong Kong. And when you think about that later, you feel the feeling. Not just think about the city, but it's a feeling that you have.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you share that with me. And the other thing is, right now, if I'm thinking about Hong Kong and any place around here, it's only a thought away. If I think about the U.S., it's far away. It's in a fog. It's not there. And consequently, when I'm there thinking about here. But when I'm on the flight, halfway between, I'm nowhere. Both places seem, it's foggy, it's a distance, it's a certain thing with your time that gets messed up. I just wonder if you feel the same things.
I absolutely feel exactly the same things. I just arrived here last night from Tokyo, and there was the 4 or 5 disembodied hours up in the air, 36,000 feet, when I was nowhere. I was nowhere and everywhere, in a way. I was literally in the clouds. And that's a very special feeling. And then you land, and I got out into the Hong Kong airport, and suddenly Hong Kong just hit me. The sounds, the humidity, the smell, the signage, I mean, everything, it just hits you. It drenches you in its Hong Kongness. And I'd just been drenched in Tokyo-ness. And it's exhilarating. And I literally thought last night, God, you've been doing this for 40 years and you're still just a little kid. And I really felt that way. I just looked around and thought, oh my God, this is Hong Kong. It was so exciting to me. It's the magic of travel. It really is. And I still believe that planes are magic. I have no idea how they function, how they get us from here to there, up in the air. That just doesn't seem, physically possible to me. And then when you get off the plane, wherever you are, certain smells I associate with Hawaii or Bali, and you just know suddenly, I'm here. And it's absolute magic, because 5 hours, 10 hours ago, you were not there. You were in a totally different place. And the magic of the world gets reaffirmed and reaffirmed and reaffirmed for me that way. And so we absolutely share that same feeling, and it's such a gift to be able to experience it when we travel. Let's keep on traveling.
On that high note.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you.